Good afternoon, Trojans. I'm Erica Maldonado, Senior Associate Director of USC Dornsife Alumni Relations. Thank you for joining us for today's Dornsife Dialogue. If you're watching on Zoom, you're welcome to submit a question at any time using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you have to leave today's discussion early or want to watch or listen again, it will be on our Dornsife Dialogues podcast, available on all your favorite podcast platforms. A link to the video will also be on the Dornsife Dialogues section of our website. Make sure to follow USC Dornsife on all social channels. Our handle is at USC Dornsife. Now I'll turn it over to the interim dean of the USC Dornsife College of Letters, Arts, and Sciences, Mo El Najjar.
Good afternoon. Welcome back to Dornsife Dialogues. I don't know about you, but I've been hearing whispers of a presidential election in America. The media blitz is focused on only a handful of swing states, and polls suggest that 3 weeks out, the candidates are running neck and neck. When we examine these polls, we find recurring narratives about the American electorate, preferences for certain policy positions, the ways that values shape opinions, and the changing demographics of each party's base. But beneath the headlines and the polling data, there are groups of voters who've been largely overlooked, groups that have traditionally been less likely to turn out on election day. Low-income Americans, people who haven't been to college, and people from underrepresented minority populations. Their voices may be less prominent in the national conversation, but they just might tip the scales. Exploring complex issues like this one is where research universities can play an outsized role. They are places where we are encouraged to dig deeper and to follow the truth without worrying about clicks and views. And while there is a place for punditry in the national dialogue, I think we all stand to benefit from a little more expertise and a lot more civility in our information diet. This is what our Center for the Political Future here at USC Dornsife is all about. And we're always excited to partner with them on our Dornsife Dialogue series. The conversations never disappoint. So today, we've brought together experts to unpack what's driving underrepresented voters, the barriers they face, and why their influence in this election could change everything. Our moderator is Jane Coaston, who currently serves as a fellow at the USC Dornsife Center for the Political Future. Jane is a contributing opinion writer at the New York Times, as well as an on-air contributor for CNN's Chris Wallace show. She has reported for Vox, and her work has appeared on MSNBC, ABC, NPR, and in the National Review. So I'll turn the program over to Jane to introduce our panelists. And thank you, as always, for spending time with us here at USC Dornsife.
Hi, everyone. So happy to be here. So I want to introduce our panelists. We're going to start by talking to Mike Madrid. He is a nationally recognized political consultant and an authoritative voice on Latino voters for more than 30 years. In 2020, Madrid co-founded the Lincoln Project, which is a Republican anti-Trump organization. He served as a fellow at the USC Center for the Political Future in spring 2021. He is a senior fellow at UC Irvine's School of Social Ecology and the author of The Latino Century, published by Simon & Schuster in June of this year. Eugene Scott is a host at Axios Live, where he travels the country interviewing political and policy leaders. He was previously a senior political reporter for Axios, covering 2024 swing voters and voting rights, perfect for a conversation. And Eugene has spent more than 20 years covering politics at the local, national, and international levels. And he's also a fellow at the Harvard Institute of Politics. Eugene, Mike, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having us.
So I want to get started with a question for Eugene, because it's a two-part one. So first, which underrepresented voter groups do you think are going to have the most significant impact on swing state results this year? And when we say underrepresented, what do we mean?
Jane, thanks so much for that question. Really glad to be here and a part of this conversation. Had you asked me that question 6 months ago, I would have said Gen Z and young voters, who I still believe are going to have a huge impact on this election. But asking me today which underrepresented group is going to have the biggest impact, on the election, I would say Black and Latino men. And I hope I'm not stealing Mike's thunder in making that point. And I think it's a group that is going to have that biggest impact because it feels like a group that both parties are targeting in very different ways, significantly, and to an extent that we don't see them focusing on other groups. You may remember in 2020, there was so much energy on maybe like suburban voters and particularly suburban moms. And I feel like Black and Latino men have replaced perhaps that group as a primary focus of the candidates. And when I say underrepresented, and this ties to my first answer, I think of underrepresented groups as in a group that does not have a strong history of voting and turning out. We know that women vote at higher rates than men. And so there's a real effort to increase participation rates for men, particularly Black and Latino men.
Mike, what do you think?
Well, I mean, without saying, I want to second that motion. I think Eugene put it really, really well. Let me kind of add a little bit more texture to that, because this is foundationally different than any campaign I can remember in the past 30 years, especially as what we're recognizing with the shifting coalitions in this country, demarcated primarily by what we call the diploma divide. Those with college degrees are moving markedly towards the left. Those without college degrees equally as quickly to the right. Black and Latino men make up the largest and fastest growing group of the blue collar workforce. Latinos particularly have lower college education rates than any group in America, and are turning 18 at rates faster than any other group. This is a group that has been historically unreliable for Democratic constituencies. For 30 years, they've tried very hard, very desperately to get these voters to increase their civic participation and voting rates to very little effect, with very little success. Now they're demonstrating a much stronger proclivity to be supporting a Donald Trump. And the question remains as to whether or not they will show up for a Republican nominee, and a Republican nominee like Donald Trump, when they're showing much stronger support levels for this candidate than we've seen amongst non-white constituencies in the past. So one of the really fascinating things is, as part of this diploma divide that's reshaping the country, is we are seeing the Democratic Party actually becoming more monolithically white, relying much more on white voters, white college-educated voters specifically, white college-educated female voters even more specifically. And we're likely to see one of the largest, if not the largest, gender gap in the history of American politics this November, and Republicans increasingly relying on people of color that have a lower turnout history, a lower propensity vote history, as we call it, to help them push them over that margin of victory. So it's a little bit more than academic. We're actually seeing some of this manifest on the ground with get out the vote efforts. You're seeing Democrats kind of being a lot more choosy in who they're trying to turn out to vote. They don't want to turn out Republican votes in a lot of these communities. That was unheard of just a few years ago. And Republicans, for their part, don't have any history of being in a lot of these communities, so they don't have much infrastructure that they can rely on to actually turn out these votes. So both parties are both have an advantage and a disadvantage for the same reason. It's all going to manifest itself, I think, on who's going to turn out, whether these lower propensity, lower likelihood voters do show up. And of course, that's correlate to being underrepresented. And I think one of the most fascinating things is, in all likelihood, this is not specific to this one electoral contest. We've been seeing this kind of building for the better part of a decade. It's just become much more measurable now. And I think it's going to change the way we politic. It's to change the way both parties build their infrastructure. And in all likelihood, it's going to change the policies and the candidates that both parties put forth going forward.
Mike, I want to start with you, and then Eugene, I'd love for you to chime in. What are some of the specific challenges that low-income Americans face in participating in the electoral process? Because I think across the board, if we think about this, not just in terms of rural, urban, or in terms of college educated, not college educated, but talking specifically about being low income, I think that this is a group that is often left out of voting altogether, and their needs are often not centered. How many times have we heard from Donald Trump about the beautiful voters? So how can the barriers that low income Americans face, and what kind of challenges do they face in the first place, Mike?
I'm going to offer what might be a little bit of a unique answer to that, but I think the data is really bearing this out. There's a believability problem, and it's particularly acute in the Democratic Party. We saw this in the New York Times Siena poll, which was released just a couple of days ago. Even though a wide swath of voters of color believe that, quote unquote, the Democratic Party understands people like me, the Democratic Party scores really, really low marks on whether or not these same voters believe that the party can or will do anything about it to change their lives. And so for a very long time, these voters have been hearing from the Democratic Party, believing the Democratic Party, but probably being let down about the results and the lack of change that they perceive is affecting their lives. Conversely, what you have is Donald Trump, who's getting, with Hispanic men specifically, 37% support of Latino voters, which is in a historically high range, but only 30% of his voters believe that he actually understands problems facing people like us. There's literally a 7-point gap between people who think they understand voters like him and who are actually voting for him. And that's why I say I think there's a real strong believability problem. It's that these voters are becoming numb or immune to the idea that the parties are actually either willing or able to do anything for them, even if they believe that they understand those problems. So to me, this believability problem, I hate the term apathy because I don't believe it's apathy. I just believe it's a general disaffection, where they're no longer believing politicians or that government itself can do anything prescriptively to better their lives. And that's the danger for our institutions. It's danger for the confidence and trust we have in the belief of our government, because you have to have that at very high levels in order to keep democracy going. So I think there's some unique challenges that are developing. Again, a lot of the sentiment is particularly acute with the very young, but they again are not looking to politicians to actually change their lives. And once you agree to that sort of a belief system, it's not a very far leap to say why vote in the first place. It just doesn't make a difference.
Eugene, what do you think?
I'm trying to answer truthfully in a way that doesn't get me in trouble. I think working class voters know that they are not the primary demographics historically that candidates seek to turn out. I think when working class voters say, I don't think the parties care about me, they are not as far off as party leaders might suggest. We very often hear candidates talk about what they will want to do for the middle class. Very rarely do candidates explicitly say, this is what I want to do for poor people. And this is because we know middle class voters, college educated voters vote at higher rates than working class people and people who have not gone to college. And so you are asking a group or groups of people to engage with a process that just hasn't prioritized and certainly doesn't center them. And that can be a real challenge in terms of whether or not they determine that this is worth their time and their energy when they could be investing in other things. And lastly, I'll say this piece, and this is not a jab as much as it is just a fact. We know that a lot of media consumption, at least historically, has been consumed primarily by college educated professionals opposed to working class people. And so the learning curve, a lot of times, in terms of just figuring out what's going on and who these individuals are, is steeper for working class people, not because they are less intelligent. It's just less familiar. And so you're dealing with people who have to perhaps take extra steps to figure out what's going on in ways that are unique to them.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think also it's challenging. This is something I think about all the time. Even when we're talking about what working class means, we have successfully stratified that Republicans think we're talking about coal miners and Democrats think we're talking about waitresses, and they're both right.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating because, you know, I've written about identity politics. Is probably the area I'm most fascinated by. And I'm not here to tell people what they are and what they aren't, but I will say, I'm sure we all have talked to people who maybe like view themselves as more working class or blue collar, who I'm not quite sure actually do, right? Like, so I mean, there's
been a
right?
lot of, yeah, there's a real sense that like you didn't go to college, but you run a Toyota dealership. Like
That's the perfect example, right? I mean, we know people who didn't go to college, but who make six figures, not like close to $500,000, and but their core and their values are working class. I mean, one of them is the vice presidential candidate on the GOP side, right? You know, he's like, I went to an Ivy League and I worked in Silicon Valley, but my grandmother is from Kentucky, so that's who I am. And so it's very difficult. That's very fascinating in terms of how we decide those things. And there are also, I mean, we all know that there are people with master's degrees struggling to hit like $40,000 or $45,000 in teaching school, and right. And so I don't think anyone would. I mean, I was going to say I don't think anyone would consider a teacher working class, but maybe like an early childhood education, like a Head Start teacher. I don't know, right? It's really confusing, and it's based on where you are. A nurse, right? Well, I mean, it depends on where you are, and so you have different ideas about what that means.
Mike, I want to ask you, are there any notable differences on the issues that motivate underrepresented voters in urban areas versus rural areas in swing states?
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, I'm sure that there are. It's going to depend on which swing state, of course. For example, in Pennsylvania, you've got to be for fracking. I mean, the people that are working in the energy patch and fracking are increasingly non-white. It's a large Puerto Rican constituency there. It's probably fracking is not nearly the issue in Georgia or Nevada as it is in Pennsylvania. But you do have to, again, the common thread I think that I've found with a lot of underrepresented groups is that working class agenda. And let's be mindful, I mean, just to the other part of the conversation, which I thought was really insightful, we're calling it the diploma divide for a reason. We don't call it the income divide, right? There's a lot of people who do not have a diploma, college degree, that are making higher incomes that do have blue collar values and vice versa. It is literally the act of college and attending and graduating from college that changes political behavior or not. And that's the demarcation point. So when we're talking about underrepresented, whether it's kind of the rural poor in the outskirts of the collar counties of Atlanta, Georgia, or whether it's in Erie, Pennsylvania, or in outside of Maricopa County, the through line is about, I think, what could loosely be called the blue collar culture. It's a commitment to these industries and to these people rather than one specific policy per se. Although, like I said, fracking, I think, is a great example. It's going to play very differently in these different communities, but they're both central. They're both central to communicating with people who are not college degreed.
Eugene, now I'm going to say this because I'm aware that being misled by misinformation doesn't know a party and does not know wealth. We have recently learned that some of our richest citizens are very gullible. That's all I'll say. But what role do you think, if any, does misinformation play in suppressing turnout among underrepresented voters, and how can this be combated effectively?
It's a huge role. I mean, the reality is, as you noted, everybody's affected by disinformation. I think I was interviewing the head of Black Voters Matter, and I'm pretty confident that if all of us had to take an exam of like which ads are real or which ads have been tampered with, like we would get some wrong. Because it's just so good at this point. And the AI in terms of impersonating people's voices, it's just out of control right now. But I think when you don't have, and I know I sound very biased as a journalist, but when you don't have a healthy news diet or a regular news diet, your idea of what is a reliable outlet and source just isn't there. And so, I've had friends and family members send me links that I could almost immediately tell this isn't a reputable news website. But if you don't regularly consume news, you won't be able to detect that. And the reality is, people who are more working class and don't regularly engage news, especially like the written news, print media. I guess it's weird to say print at this point because it's online. Are perhaps susceptible a little more in ways that people who regularly consume news aren't.
Mike, what lessons do you think can be drawn from successful voter mobilization efforts in previous elections that were aimed at underrepresented groups? Because we've seen 2008, 2012, like you've seen these big pushes to get previously underrepresented groups to vote, and you see that again you saw that in 2020 and in 2016. So what have we learned? What works? What doesn't?
I really like that question because I think there are still so many people from our citizen voting age eligible population that are either unregistered or don't vote, even in our record high turnout elections, that I'm not sure we can say with a high degree of confidence that it's any of it's really successful. I mean, there are certainly some that are more successful than others. But again, I think a lot of this has to do with the fact that we rely on the political system itself to drive and engage people to believe and buy in and support it, even though people don't. And I think that is the biggest challenge. So some of those things that are the most successful are those things that are driven largely by popular culture, when it becomes sort of a cultural phenomenon to engage and be involved in it, rather than having your typical PSA to register and vote, to make it something that's important from a community perspective, oftentimes on things that aren't directly political, not advocating for or against a piece of legislation, not advocating for or against a party, not advocating for or against a candidate, but rather advocating for or against something where the community sees some overwhelming sentiment. For example, some of the largest bursts of voter turnout and registration we have seen over the course of the past 30 years or so have sometimes been when the community is under attack. 1994, for example, is a perfect example of Latino mobilization that catalyzed the multi-generational, voting registration numbers exploded at that time. You can see that, for example, in maybe a foreign policy crisis, as we're seeing in the Middle East with younger people specifically, where they're not necessarily voting for or against legislation, but there's such an external shock that people feel beyond their political identity that they engage in something that they wouldn't otherwise engage in. Now, the challenge is to do that aspirationally. It's easy when the community feels that it's under a threat or under attack, but that's not a healthy way to build democracy or civic engagement. And I'm not too certain that, other than a couple of maybe exceptionally charismatic candidates, that we see that happening or have happened in the course of our lifetimes. Think of Obama specifically in 2008 might have been one of those generational moments. But beyond that, we're not really seeing that because, again, there's just such a disbelief and distrust in the institution that we're going to have to find ways to find political solutions or non-political through non-political means.
Eugene, what do you think when people talk about economic factors and kitchen table issues? I always get a little bit annoyed because lots of things are kitchen table issues, but how do you think economic factors like inflation and job market conditions, or more importantly, our perception of inflation and job market conditions, how do those influence the political priorities of low-income, working class, middle-class voters in swing states?
I was having this conversation this morning with a good friend who is a senior policy advisor for a senator, a Democratic senator, and he was expressing his frustration with what he would say has been a relatively ineffective job of the Democratic Party, including the Vice President and President Biden, of really speaking to the very real economic anxieties of working class voters in the country right now. We can continue to say inflation is not really a thing. The stock market is doing as well as it is, and just pointing out all of these other examples that support the facts of where the economy is. But the reality is there are single moms with 2 kids that feel very differently right now. And the messaging to them has just not been as effective as it perhaps could have been. When people say that they made more money during the Trump administration, or they feel like they make less money now, sending them a bunch of like stats or facts telling them that that's not true, it's just not working. People feel not believed and unheard, and as a result, they very well may vote for the candidate who does hear them and make them feel considered, even if what they are saying is less than true based on stats. And so, economic anxiety is a phrase that a lot of us became incredibly familiar with in 2016 and frustrated with in a lot of ways. But the reality is it's real. I was it the Clinton campaign that was like, it's the economy, stupid. And it's very much going to play a factor in how people vote this year.
Yeah, can I speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I absolutely, because I also want to ask you, because I think that question of like perception is really important, because we remember during the Trump administration, Trump would routinely, trumpet stock market gains or different things that the same thing will happen under Biden, and now it's bad. So it seems to me that in part, like, yes, people are struggling, but there's also perception issue here. And I think that that's challenging for some people to understand. But Mike, please.
Yeah, I don't believe it's perception at all. I think it's absolute reality, and let me explain why. And again, there is a unique window with COVID and who blames what for COVID and what happened with crashing the economy. That's absolutely true. But look, during the 85% of the Biden administration, interest rates tripled. And we say inflation was up 6 or 7%, but it was up 6 or 7% a year for 3 years. That means our currency devalued by at least 20%. So inflation may be down to 2 or 3% now, but that's off of 20% loss of value from 3-4 years ago. So the idea that there's a perception that things are more expensive, that is quantifiably false. And when people say, like in polling, it's the economy, overwhelmingly, if you look at the crosstabs, overwhelmingly, it's an affordability problem. We are creating more jobs, but what is the point of having a job if you can't afford to live on that job? And people who live not even paycheck to paycheck know that. Like, this reality is their reality, and it is painful and it is deep. 1 in 5 Hispanic men are employed in the construction industry or a related field. Now, when interest rates triple, that's a gut punch to 20% of Latino households from the get, let alone the increase in rents that have gone up, the price of housing, which has exploded over those years. And again, I can't drive this home hard enough. The devaluation of our currency, we all know, it's not perception. We all know that things are more expensive. Go out and buy a meal and tell me it's not more expensive. Of course it's more expensive. Everything is more expensive considerably. And so when you at the lower end of the economic ladder, you are not immune to this. So you feel it more. You are more responsive to price increases. And that's why, again, in the New York Times Siena poll, only 20% of Latinos said that the economy was in good or excellent condition. 20%. That means 80% don't believe that at all. And they've got very good reason to. It's their reality. And it may not be our reality, but it's absolutely their reality.
Mhm.
I mean,
Mhm.
it's the reality of anyone who has attempted to go to a cocktail bar in the last like
Right.
I was just thinking about happy hour, which probably should tell you something about me. But
look, Eugene,
yeah,
you and me both, at a certain point, I have started to notice that my glass of Prosecco did get more expensive, but
it's true.
it just did. It just did.
It's true.
So I'm interested, Eugene, because we've been hearing a lot about voter engagement among communities of color and how that may have changed since 2020. But I think that something else that's interesting to me is that we're seeing everyone going after communities of color. I think that there was kind of this idea when I was, many moons ago in the 90s that African American voters for Republicans were just kind of like, ideally they don't vote, but we don't really try to go after them. That's changed. That's changed completely. So what are the factors driving these changes, and how has voter engagement changed with communities of color since 2020?
No, this is such an important question. Well, one, as we all know, um, while historically the electorate has been looked at as black and white, this country is much more diverse than that and much more nuanced than that. And the fact that we have a candidate running who would be the first Asian president speaks to that. There's outreach, at least from the Democratic Party specifically, towards like Asian American voters who were very key in helping deliver Georgia in 2020. And so there's just nuance happening. Even the Latino voter outreach, I was a political reporter in Arizona for years. And for so often when people thought about Latino voters, they only thought about the Southwest, where we know that there are lots of Latino voters in North Carolina, right? And other demographics. There's real concern about Arab voters in Michigan. And so communities of color is being looked at far more broadly than black and white. Identity, as was noted earlier, all of us are multiple things. And so like the GOP knows that they are strong with working class voters. Historically, they've prioritized white working class voters in rural places. But since 2016 and certainly 2020, they've come to realize, hey, there are working class voters in Las Vegas. They are not white and they are not rural, but they would be attracted to our message if we focused on them. Same thing with Black men in Philadelphia and Detroit. And so there just has been much more nuance in terms of how these parties speak to voters of color, recognizing that despite the fact that Democrats continue to have a strong hold on like college educated Black women, there's so many other types of voters of color besides that voting bloc.
Mike, what do you think are the most important ways that both parties can adapt their outreach strategies to reach non-college educated voters? What do you think is really worth focusing on? Because I think that it's an error to think that if you're non-college educated, you don't exist alongside everybody else and you don't have a lot of different issues on your mind. But obviously, there are going to be issues that resonate more deeply. What do you think those are, and what are the best ways to talk about them?
Yeah, certainly. So let me say, I think broadly, I'll start there, then I'll nail down to specifics. Broadly, the party that is able to speak to a multi-ethnic working class in this country is going to be the dominant party of the next generation. I believe that the Democratic Party right now is really struggling with the working class piece. And despite its increasing diversification, I think the Republican Party is really struggling with the multi-ethnic piece. And the tensions within both coalitions are really going to be exacerbated on both of those fronts as we continue down this transformation into this new reality. Those, I think, will be the battlegrounds. In what used to be moderate versus conservative, moderate versus liberal, it's really going to be those fights between the parties on those two issues that will define sort of what we used to call centrist or more to the right or left. So having said that, one of the things that I find particularly hopeful in this troubling time is that a lot of what you're seeing from voters, if you look at Black and brown voters, and you did like a blind taste test or blind poll test, let's say, you would find that more often than not, they are the more moderate voters in both parties. And that's really, I think, a positive development, because so much of what we have begun to scratch each other's eyeballs out on as a people are on these cultural issues. And as we start to see the non-white share of the vote grow, the potential of us getting back to some of these working class issues, I think, grows. Now, the Democrats will approach it, I think, the way that they historically have. They'll talk about greater unionization rates, project labor agreements, the need to have a bigger, social safety net. They'll talk about healthcare and childcare in terms of a working class issue. That's all very legitimate. That's a good thing. That's a healthy thing. That's the perspective of those that believe that we should have a stronger hand of government in making our society better. Republicans, for their part, will hopefully get back to a time of talking about things like tax policy and regulatory relief and trying to create entrepreneurship. I think it's really fascinating to hear Kamala Harris's opportunity economy. One of the centerpieces is talking about giving tax credit and tax cuts to business owners and to corporations in order to give employees ownership in the company. I mean, that's straight 1980s Jack Kemp Republicanism. I think that's good because there are policy solutions that are trying to reach to the working class through a right and left spectrum. And what I think Kamala Harris is doing is kind of through the center. So I think as long as we get back to these economic working class issues broadly, I don't think that there's a silver bullet. There's certainly some that work better. But as long as we're having a debate of ideas on class issues again, and we've gotten very far away from most of that, I think, over the course of the past decade, certainly, but probably the last 20 years generally, I think we're going to see much more moderating influence in our politics. We could talk about, taxes on tips where there's some common agreement. Tariffs, Trump's tariff policy is obviously, I think, appropriately lambasted, but we have to remember his first round of tariffs have all been kept intact by the Biden-Harris administration because they believe in them. So there is some protectionist, there is some economic populist issues that are recurrent on both the right and the left. And when we focus on those, I think we do ourselves a lot of good in terms of not only healing the body politic, but also in decreasing the polarization that has torn the country apart.
Yeah, I think a lot about that intersection between class and cultural issues, though I will say some things I think are interesting is that occasionally we think that like there is a class you get to where then you get to care about cultural issues. But let's keep in mind, the state with the largest percentage of same-sex couples raising children, Mississippi. Like,
wow.
We think all the time about how, this is kind of it's a hobby horse of mine. So as I am in charge here, I'm going to bring it up. We sometimes think that, you get to a certain income bracket and then you care a lot about trans rights or abortion or LGBT rights or cultural issues writ large. But when you talk to people up and down, Obergefell did not have some sort of financial ranking that you needed to get to before you could get married. And so I think it's important to think that like cultural issues are very divisive, and culture wars are perfect for politics because they are inherently unsolvable. You can't win and you can't lose, just keep fighting. But I do think it's important to remember that many of the people we're talking about who are concerned about the cost of groceries are also thinking about, the cost of, getting gender affirming care, or they're thinking about the cost of, facing religious discrimination. And so, I think it's important that all of this is interwoven, but that is just my hobby horse. So I'd like to get.
No, that's such an important point. That's such an important point that I need to remember more. I think very often our elected officials think either or, and it's just not. How significant it is, it varies depending on the voter. But
it really does.
It's not.
Well, I think it's more important to acknowledge that there is and there always has been a blue-collar working class culture in our society. And we used to in the 80s, as Republicans call them, Reagan Democrats. These were Democrats who were union members working in these industries, who were directly appealed to on cultural values, not necessarily socially conservative values, but on issues like Bill Clinton was masterful at this. Playing by the rules, right? Showing up to work. The blue-collar cultural value is, as long as I play by the rules, I don't need to get rich, but if I do the right things, my kids can have a better life than I had, however we view that to be, and that's the promise of America. That's a cultural value. It's a little bit different than our rich, by the way, but that's what blue collar working class values, that culture, that glue has always been. I'm not too sure we believe in that as much anymore.
I think that's a good point. And this is a conversation we could be having for the next 6 hours. And regrettably, I'm pretty sure that we all can't stay for 6 hours, but offline, we can keep doing this. So I'm going to bring up, we've got some great questions coming from the audience. And so I am interested in thinking about, let's start with a question from Diana, who asks, do you think the significant early voting in Georgia, what do you think that means anything for the upcoming results? I think, to me, it tells me this is going to be a really, really, really high participation election, more so than 2020, perhaps. But Eugene, what do you think?
Yeah, I was going to say, we obviously do not know who these votes are for. I think it's worth noting that Trump, who blasted early voting and mail-in voting in 2020, has warmed up to the idea. And so it's safe to assume that some of those voters are supporters of his. But I think what we do know, or it would be fair to guess, I guess we won't know until it's all said and done, is that we're probably going to break some records. I mean, we have broken a record. Georgia has already broken the early day, the early voting record, but people are engaged. And I think that is fascinating and telling, because we know that 6 months ago, people were not engaged like this. And they were telling us repeatedly in surveys that they didn't know if they were going to vote, or that they knew they were not going to vote. And we are seeing that no longer be the case based on how many people are already voting.
Yeah, and let me say this. I think that's exactly right. But I think even our conceptions of what high turnout elections mean is going to change. We are in a period of extended high turnout elections that began really in 2018. It's the highest midterm election in over a century. 2020, the presidential election 2 years later, was the highest turnout election ever in all of American history. Then 2022 was the second highest midterm election behind 2018. We're on track to have a very high turnout election. But I want to really caution people that trying to discern who is voting and how they're voting is it's a fool's errand to make. First of all, because the trend line has been completely disrupted with 2020. We don't know what any of this means. And to the idea that somehow high turnout elections benefit, like the Democrats, for example, which has been conventional wisdom, was disproved in 2020. Yes, Donald Trump lost, but Republicans picked up the House in the highest turnout election in the history of the country. And if you look at these low turnout elections ever since then, Democrats have done particularly well. So this diploma divide is, again, reshaping who is benefiting from low and high turnout elections. Democrats are now increasingly benefiting from high turnout elections, and Republicans are increasingly benefiting from high turnout elections.
Yeah, I think I will also say, this is just a word to those listening. If you see anything about exit polling, ignore. Don't read it. That doesn't mean anything. It's until we get the results will be the results. Exit polling tells us markedly nothing, except for analysis that we can do later, where I bring up fun facts like 1% of African-American women in the state of Pennsylvania voted for Trump, which, as I've said repeatedly, I believe is a number you could fit in a gym. And so I think, let's see, next question. Actually, it's a question for Mike. Congratulations on your book. What are some interesting trends you're seeing among Latino voters right now?
I think there's a couple of them. The most interesting thing is this gender gap, because I think it's going to really change the contours of not only our politics in the very short term, but in the medium and long term as well. I think it's going to change society, frankly. Latinos not only have the largest gender gap in voting, they have the largest diploma divide, as I mentioned earlier. We also have a very, very strong proclivity to vote for women and female candidates. I think most of you guys know that we have more Latinas in our California state legislature than Latinos. We are almost at parity in a red state like Texas at 55-45. It's 55 men, 45 women. Florida's not that far off. States like New Jersey, overwhelmingly women. Red states like Utah, the leadership in both minority parties, Democratic Party, are Latinas. So there's also this trope about machismo driving sort of this rightward shift. I think it's quantifiably not true. Hillary Clinton was one of the highest vote getters we've ever had. There's just this growing sense that Latinas are the future. I believe that. I think we're seeing it in data and demography. Another, I think, thing to consider is that abortion rights, reproductive rights is a winner amongst Latinos. It always has been. It's becoming more pronounced. And so this assimilative effect where we're seeing third and fourth generation Hispanic men shifting to the right is also having a compounding effect with women who are moving more to the left because of these cultural issues. So there's a lot at play. There's a lot of, I think, again, challenges to the idea that non-white voters, minority voters vote a certain way is manifesting in more than just, you know, a traditional Republican Democrat format. It's also about gender. It's also about college degree. It's also about culture. And I think it's an exciting time to be watching these voters. But yeah, that's, I think, a couple off the top of my head.
Let's see. We've got some questions about Asian American voters and where they stand. I think there's actually some interesting polling data that came out that Kamala Harris is performing better with Asian American voters than Joe Biden was. But Eugene, any thoughts on kind of where that community might stand? I mean, I say community, realizing that it is a massive group of people with a wide variety of experience.
Absolutely. It is fair to say that Asian Americans lean Democratic, but not to the degree that Black voters obviously do, or even Latino voters. And to your point, there are some communities within the Asian American community that are more conservative, like Vietnamese voters. But it has been said, I don't know which data supports this, but historically, a big indicator of whether you will vote is if you come from a family with a history of voting. And historically, many Asian Americans have, especially the kids of immigrants, have said that they didn't grow up seeing their parents voting. And so as a result, both parties, Democrats, quite frankly, more than Republicans, have seen this community as a huge opportunity, especially considering that Asian Americans are the fastest growing ethnic group in the country. And so there are just so many voters out there to engage and get into the process, the electoral process, especially in some of these swing states that will just decide where the election is. I think the idea that certainly not all, but even most Asian American voters are in New York and in California, just is not as supported by just, demographics and census as it used to be.
Yeah, if I could,
please.
Chime in real quick on that. So as you mentioned in my introduction, I'm a senior fellow at UC Irvine, the School of Social Ecology, that we're doing a lot of work on this. I think the Asian Pacific Islander vote, Eugene correctly characterized how it's breaking. A lot of this, I would argue, is also correlate to the diploma divide. Much higher college attainment and degreed voters. But also, I think one fascinating thing, if you look at Orange County, California, where there are 3 House seats in play, there's a very good chance that all 3 of those will be held by Asian Americans at the end of by the end of November. 1 Democrat, 2 Republicans. A lot of that is a function of a high number of college-educated Asian voters in both New York and in California, as Eugene was pointing out.
So, Eugene, actually, both of you, are you seeing differences in voting decisions? So we're talking about within communities of color. Are you seeing those differences that we see with white people? Between Gen Z and boomers? Like, are we seeing the same types of divides that we talk about all the time with larger communities? Are we seeing those with communities of color as well?
I mean, when I talk to focus groups and swing voters and just man on the street, I mean, one of the big differences is, I mean, communities of color do talk about racism and xenophobia much more than like white voters. It is a very real concern of theirs. It's not something that is being made up or their imagination. It's, the Stop Asian Hate was a real concern for people. Police brutality against Black and Latino people was very real for voters. What is interesting, I don't think to the same scale, but a conversation related to racism that is happening within the white community, if one could say that, is reverse racism. And not just at the working class level, which is why there was so much attention paid to the overturning of affirmative action. There is some real concern about DEI initiatives post 2020 having gone too far. And that's why you see a number of Republican candidates speaking to those concerns that exist within white voters. I do think one thing that is really interesting among like voters of color, Black and Latino, but what I'm seeing mostly is within Black voters is there is more conversation happening among Gen Z about the United States role on the international stage than we perhaps saw among boomers. And so we're all on college campuses, and there is some concern, to say the least, about America's role in Gaza, America's role in Sudan, America's role in Haiti, in ways that we just don't hear older voters talking about at the same level.
Mike, I've got a polling question for you, which is always fun because polling drives everyone insane.
Yeah.
Is it reflecting changing dynamics in underrepresented voters and in general? Like when we're looking at polling, are we seeing what underrepresented groups are thinking? Or how does that work?
Yeah, well, I could speak only to Latinos specifically because that's my area of expertise. So let me do that, because you're going to start seeing a lot of people playing fast and loose with Latino numbers. And I write extensively on this in my book on how they do it. Basically, the idea of Latino identity is very fluid. It's much more fluid than certainly African American and or Asian Pacific Islander identity, and it changes mostly generationally. And those changes are very significant. So you could, if you oversample third generation English exclusive Latinos, you're going to get a very decidedly different outcome than if you're talking to first generation Spanish speakers. And both partisans have figured this out. So there's a whole cottage industry on the left in the Democratic circles of using a pollster, one firm specifically, but others are jumping in on the game too, of doubling the number of Spanish language respondents in their polling to give themselves a much more leftward skew, especially on things like immigration and immigration-related issues. Now, what you're seeing is a real big divergence from credible public pollsters that aren't partisan, that are showing this rightward shift or this movement towards the Republicans. At the same time, you will see very low levels of Republican support in these same polls. So the methodological questions that you hear pollsters fighting about weighting and balancing, those are true, but there's not a whole lot of discussion on something like language, the appropriate number of interviews in Spanish, for example, when it's really central to getting the community right. So most standard pollsters will say 17 to 20%. I think 20% is a little bit high of Spanish language interviews. But a lot of these Democratic pollsters will use 35% Spanish language responses, and they come up with a very different outcome, and they will argue, well, this is a better reflection of the Latino community. There hasn't been enough discussion about this type of behavior amongst pollsters because where most of the fights on polling tend to be more on the scientific nature of the underlying weighting of the instrument, weighting, W-E-I-G-H-T-I-N-G, weighting of the instrument. There's been almost no discussion about things like Spanish, the appropriate composition of a Spanish language model in a poll. So the answer is yes and no, right? It's like, how do you determine which is underrepresented, which is not? If you skew towards a certain generation, you're going to get a very different political perspective, all of them with a very legitimate claim to representing the Latino community, although they may not be reflective of the entire community.
So
I also
please.
I want to say related to that, one thing I also think really that is really disrupting our understanding of how race plays out, at the voting booth is we are in a much more multiracial society, and acknowledging the long-held reality that people can be of two or even more races. And that is factoring into right? Like who thought? Who would have thought? And people are fascinated. Young people are fascinated when we talk about how, I believe it was before the 2000 census. I think it was, maybe it was earlier, but that you couldn't mark multiple races. And so, one could argue that our understanding of how people of color vote has kind of been off because we were not accurately classifying people of color. And so now all of us know people who are combinations of ethnicities that we just didn't even think about very often when we were kids. And suggesting that they would vote a certain way because of how people voted 10 to 20 years ago just doesn't apply as much anymore. I mean, the reality is the Democratic nominee is a biracial candidate in a combination that many people just usually don't think about.
I think about it all the time, but obviously I'm biased here. Like it has been crazy to see the polling numbers of just people being like, people of one or more race. I'm like, yes, welcome to me filling out any form before like 2008.
Yeah.
So I want to end with a question for both of you. Eugene,
Sure.
looking beyond 2024, how might the increasing focus on underrepresented voters shape long-term strategies for both political parties? Which I think is a great question. I mean, I think after 2012, we all remember the GOP autopsy where and then in 2016 where they're like, never mind. Well, are we getting back to a point in which we're thinking about how that type of outreach again, or is something else going to happen?
So I'm very eager. I'm not skeptical. Regardless of what my tone says, I really don't know what will happen. I'm very eager to see if a lot of the pushback and concerns and questions that Black and Latino men have about these candidates actually translates to actually showing up, right? I mean, people can tweet and talk in barbershops and at family events and like not vote. And if that is what happens, I don't know that there will be as significant of a shift to address the needs of these voters if they don't have any stake in the game. If we do see an outcome that is deeply influenced by what Black and Latino men do on election day or before, I think it's fair to expect both parties to really up the ante on reaching these voters when it comes to the midterms, because as Mike noted, elections are every 2 years now in terms of importance to these parties. And that I think will be a very real shift. Despite all of that, one thing we know, and I was talking to some folks about it earlier today, is arguably the most influential demographic in politics, be it at the state houses or the White House, are donors. And so I don't want to overplay how much parties will listen to voters when the reality is some of the folks they're just always going to listen to the most are their donors.
Mike, what do you think?
Well, I mean, find myself agreeing a lot with Eugene here. I think we are at a moment in time where there's a generational inflection point where kind of old guys like me have a very different and unique understanding of the world and the way voting behavior works compared to these emergent younger voters that are really changing and challenging some of the basic assumptions of what it means to be non-white. This is a step in the process of becoming a non-white majority country, which we will be in 15 short years. And this dynamic is going to start happening extremely fast going forward now. Again, 38% of Latinos are under the age of 30 years old. It's the largest ethnic demographic in America. It's starting to really, really happen quickly. And I think that one of the great ironies, we talked about the 2012 autopsy correctly, but understand something. The 2012 autopsy was saying if we don't become a more diverse party quickly, we are going to be irrelevant. And then Donald Trump is elected in large part, or at least in some part, as a part of the backlash to that kind of thinking. But the Republican Party has become a considerably more diverse party under Donald Trump than at any time since before the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And it's becoming more so every year. And at the same time, the Democratic Party is becoming more monolithically white. So we again, the conclusion, the purpose of the 2012 autopsy was right, but they were right for the wrong reasons. and it's challenging both parties. This class really does take a much greater role in an increasingly diverse society, racially diverse society.
Both of you, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for your eloquence. Thank you so much for the work that you both do. This has been a great conversation that I would absolutely continue for, as I said, 6 more hours. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to USC Dornsife for hosting us, and looking forward to finding out what happens with, all of this in about 3 weeks or so. Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Thanks for having us.